You've probably been hearing about it for the past few months, but now it's time to talk about how it all went and what it's all about. Please give a very warm welcome to Travis Ralston as he talks about Authenticated Media.
Hello. So yeah, I am Travis. I am on the Trust and Safety team for Matrix.org. I'm also Director of Standards Development for Matrix.org. Those are just a couple of my hats. I have quite a few, but for the purposes of this talk, at least, we are talking about Authenticated Media, what it's like to roll out such a large feature, and then also how to ship large spec features. In this case, the Authenticated Media change is fairly breaking for a lot of the ecosystem. And the goal was to make sure that most people didn't notice that. And so hopefully we've accomplished that. And some of these ideas are actually transferable to smaller MSCs that may be a little less breaking than, say, Authenticated Media. But first, media in Matrix is possibly something different from what you were thinking of, because media can also have a WebRTC context. So when we're talking about media in the context of Matrix, we are talking about images, videos, files, all of that sort of stuff. That is all part of what makes up media itself. Media can also be large, so we don't want to actually include it in the event itself, because if we have a room message that is actually including the image, and those are 8 megabytes each for modern 4K video or photos, those events can get quite large, and then they fill up your database, and so we don't really want that, and so we don't include it inline. So instead, the clients upload that media, they get a sort of reference URI that they can use, they include that in the event instead, and then that is sent out to all of the servers, which also makes media a little bit different from events themselves. So events are actually pushed out to all of the servers and then onto their clients for all the users in the room. And then once the client sees that event, or rather the user sees that event, the media is then asked to be downloaded from the server. Those endpoints that are used to download that media have, up until now, have been unauthenticated, which causes issues. Abuse is not great, and Authenticated Media tends to fix that. So just as a brief overview of pretty much what I just said, Alice in this case is uploading some media, just random bytes effectively. It could be encrypted, it could be unencrypted, it could be both. They get an MXC URI back from their home server. They include this in the event. The event gets pushed all the way down to Bob through Federation. Bob then sees the event, their client asks to download it, and that goes back over Federation to grab the bytes again, and then that proxies back through to Bob. And the problem is that last step is unauthenticated. That is the concern that we are trying to fix here, and that sets up a sort of stage for what a matrix spec change could look like. So, what are matrix spec changes? Spec changes are effectively just the markdown documents which further the specification. They are the actual proposal text, which allows you to just change how a lot of these things could, or how the specification can be furthered. It includes an introduction of the problem. It includes the actual proposal itself. It has alternatives, security issues, the considerations that were made along the way, as well as some identifiers that unstable implementations and stable implementations can use. So usually you start with draft status just to make sure that while you're still exploring some of these alternatives and some of these options, you can have a chance for a little bit of review and unstable implementation, coordinating that. It's a great place to actually collaborate and explore different opportunities. There is a template available. You don't have to fit that template, at least at first. You should have all of the components of that template as you get closer to that final comment period. There is lots of review. The spec core team is certainly willing to help with a lot of that. But yeah, the key details for most successful MSCs are evidence of it actually working, so that is implementation. This is where you have the actual proposal itself implemented in either a client or a server or both in many cases. You have alternatives, so that way people can see the strength of the actual solution that you're putting forward. and you just have a clear proposal because it should be pretty close to the specification itself. So for authenticated media, we have a few options, which makes things a little bit harder to fix, particularly when you are in that early stage of an MSC. You can reuse the existing access token semantics. This is how clients already authenticate to their server. Request signing or the X matrix authentication happens over federation. So that's how servers authenticate to each other that they are making a request. This is very similar to MTLS, if people are more familiar with that. So we already have those existing concepts. We can try and reuse those. Spoilers, this is what we ended up going with for now. But we also have like time-limited URLs where it just expires in a minute or 5 minutes or something like that. We can also just use pre-signed URLs, which are pretty common in like S3 and CloudFront and that sort of space, where you create a URL that only one person can access. We can also use cookies if we want to go back to the early 2000s and try and do that instead. There are some issues with that. And then we can also use some combination of the above. We could use HMAX to include those on URLs. But yeah, we'll kind of explore that in a little bit more detail as we go here. But yeah, ideally the MSC has a single option, at least by the time that it is ready for FCP. Early on, it can have multiple options. Picking one is difficult, particularly when all 5 of these are very viable. And for some MSCs, it's a little bit more clear which one is likely to be the most viable, but for authenticated media, there are 5 options. All 5 are equally viable. And so we just try and experiment and we evaluate each individual one. So reusing the existing authentication has a number of different upsides and downsides. It's easy for mobile clients and bots to account for. They just simply had to add the header. That makes it really, really easy. And they don't really have to do a whole lot else. Web clients, on the other hand, might need service workers or something very similar to that, where they have to actually intercept the request and add the headers and fight the cross-origin requests, that sort of fun stuff. Obviously, the MSC would then break copy-pasted links because you have to include your access token, and you don't want to include that in the URL because that gives full access to your account. So OIDC might also be able to help with that with scoped access tokens or something similar. And bridges also need to implement a proxy mechanism. This is going to be a theme throughout the rest of the solutions as well. Pretty much no matter what we do for authenticated media, bridges need a long-term URL that they can reference, particularly for, say, IRC, where the way that those bridges currently work is by when a media or when an event containing media is posted to a room, that is converted into a URL that is then posted to the IRC channel and is included just as a regular text message. And so when users end up clicking it later on, they need to be able to access it. So bridges, in particular, need a very long-lived URL, and none of these options really provide that. But I've bolded the first one there because clients and servers already know how to use their access token. They already use it for every single other request that they send to the home server. Servers already have to authenticate pretty much every other request as well. And so they already know what to do with that, and that's a very valuable thing to have, is so that way you don't have to reinvent a lot of new concepts within the specification. There's nothing that you have to really reintroduce or explore or provide back to the community. And so that is one of the reasons why we ended up going with this one as a sort of the initial option, but we'll kind of cover that in a little bit here. When we compare it to time-based or pre-signed URLs, just kind of merging these two concepts, they already exist in industry, which again makes it quite valuable, where people might already be familiar with it. Client developers don't have to reason about it. They don't really have to think about it, particularly if it's designed quite well. It should be relatively transparent to them. They just get the media URL and off it goes. But that might also require round trips, where you have your MXC URI in the event, and then you have to convert that into a URL. So you're doing a download for a URL and then sending that to the user. And There's some just extra HTTP calls in there. There might even be even further from that. We might be able to pre-calculate that, but that is a little bit more difficult as well, depending on the security constraints that we want to add to that. Copy-pasted links would also work sometimes. If you have a time-based URL, it's going to maybe work for a minute, but then it doesn't work after that. But that minute can be long enough for people to send their media out to other users and be very confused as to why it broke. That can obviously cause disruption within communities as they try to share images outside of their clients, and their friends find out that the thing doesn't work, but it worked when they tried to send it. Once again, bridges also need to implement a proxy mechanism because the URLs would not last for very long. So this option is almost certainly viable, but compared to reusing existing concepts, we wanted to make sure that we were not introducing anything that was too complex, at least early on. And so we ended up kind of considering this one as second priority, and we wanted to look at it a little bit more in detail after the fact, which also applies to cookies. It's also an existing concept from industry. It's also from the early 2000s. So web clients don't have to do anything about this, which is pretty good. As soon as they get a cookie on their request, they just automatically add the cookie to all future requests. And so all of your authenticated media, all of your web crests are automatically authenticated. Most HTTP libraries and mobile SDKs also support cookies. You might have to do a little bit of work to hook up the cookie jar or something similar to that. But generally speaking, they are pretty well supported throughout the overall ecosystem. But again, it might require an extra round trip, because if your client isn't syncing, it's not actively talking to the server, it's not actively requesting data, it may or may not be able to get that cookie, and so it might have to actively reach out to the server, get a cookie, come back, and then try and request the media. Also, adding on to the time-based URLs, it can just confuse users. If you're in a web client and you have those cookies, it'll work for you, but not for anybody else. And that can be especially confusing. Also, web browsers typically don't like third-party cookies. Usually your web client is not on the same domain as your home server, and that is a third-party cookie. And sometimes they just vanish, sometimes they never get set, sometimes extensions will just remove them, particularly with a privacy-conscious crowd like Matrix. Those cookies might be difficult to set. And of course, bridges need to implement a proxy mechanism still, because cookies don't translate over to IRC very well. And so then we also can explore a combination of a lot of these different options. So you can HMAC some things, let's say the access token, the URL, other details, and include a little bit of an expiration as well. So it is an existing concept from industry. A lot of these are. Pretty much all clients can support this trivially. You can pre-calculate it to avoid the redundant HTTP calls. Unfortunately, though, servers might log the query string, which causes issues. If you have a server admin that is scraping their logs, they might end up seeing this HMAC and expiration and be able to request media or be able to harvest some information, whereas typically they shouldn't be able to do that. You also might have to include the user's access token in the HMAC itself, which exposes a little bit of risk, because while the HMAC encodes or encrypts or even hashes the access token, it might still be, it's still presented information to a third party. Typically, you want that information to be kept behind something where it's not actually easily disclosed. And so, of course, yeah, bridges also still have problems with this. So overall, yeah, bridges need to just do something regardless of how we design this feature. They always need to be able to have a super long-lived URL, and so they need to typically proxy the media. So the way that we've done this with just the bridges on matrix.org is the Bridge itself has a media proxy feature to it where it sees the media URI. It then creates a URL that points to itself rather than points to the server, and presents that out to the third party. So whether that's IRC or Discord or wherever else, it presents that to the third party service. And then when those users or when that service requests that URL, it hits the bridge instead. The bridge then decodes it, verifies its own form of authentication, and then sends that back to the server, proxying the media all the way back through. So this allows the bridge to authenticate with the server still, so we don't have to violate that principle, and it allows the media to continue flowing without massive user disruption. We also require new endpoints, particularly for downloads. We also have thumbnails within Matrix, and so we need new endpoints for that. Typically, these endpoints were the same for client server and for federation, which causes a little bit of confusion when you're not sure what type of entity is hitting that particular URL. And so while we're here and while we're trying to fix things, while we're designing out our solution in the MSC process, we can split these URLs apart. And so we can have our client server endpoints specifically in the client namespace, and we can have our federation endpoints in our federation namespace. And then we can apply those authentication requirements to each individually. And so it really just helps make things a little bit cleaner. We have our own individual namespaces. We don't have to worry about weird requests coming through or complicated proxy rules, that sort of stuff. Generally speaking, the protocol also prefers just to have a few unique concepts. We don't want to have multiple new things coming through all the time. This is something that I believe in as a spec core team member. We don't really want to keep reinventing new ideas and present those to clients. Ideally, we have our rooms, our events, our crypto layer, and our authentication, and we stick to that as much as we can. We don't really want to keep subjecting particularly client developers to things that they have to implement over and over and over again. We want to reuse things where it makes sense. Also, all developers are going to be impacted by whatever we do. Authenticated media is a change, and ideally it would have been done early in the protocol. Unfortunately, due to bandwidth constraints, it had to be done now. And so, yeah, we have to figure out how to migrate a few tens of millions of users, maybe even hundreds of millions of users, onto this new system. And that also includes all the developers as well. So many of these developers are third parties where they might not necessarily have like a daytime job where they can work on it from 9 to 5. They have to work on it on weekends or in spare time. And so we want to be able to respect their time that is available and make it as minimally as invasive as possible. We also need to support CDNs and redirects because large servers in particular have quite a lot of media, and they might want to actually use a CDN to ship all of this media around. Redirects also help for bandwidth constraints where your server might be charged quite a bit for outbound bandwidth. And if you're shipping 8 megabyte photos at 5 hertz, for example, that's quite a lot of bandwidth. Your server bills might not be happy, so you might want to put it behind, say, Fastly or Cloudflare or something like that. And then critically, yeah, we're going to have to consider a transition period because we can't just break this overnight. As much as we would like to just break media overnight, that would be really helpful for us. We just can't. It will take time for users to actually adopt a lot of this stuff and consider what their client looks like, what their experience looks like, that sort of stuff. So for MSC 3916, which was the MSC that actually defined this at least as a version 1, we noticed that, yeah, all of the options are pretty much equal. The first one does have that extra plus of reusing existing concepts. So we ended up just designing that one out. We picked that one out back in 2022. Trust and Safety ended up picking up the MSc earlier this year and weighed a lot of the alternatives, came to pretty much the same conclusion, and just started prototyping it out. We spent quite a bit of time trying to figure out how to exactly implement this, which clients might be most affected by the change, which servers might be most affected by the change, and decided to spend a little bit of time with Element Web in particular, just to see what a service worker might look like and what sort of problems we might encounter with that. It turns out that the service worker is fine. It's not great. It has some issues. Sometimes browsers don't register them. Sometimes they don't update very regularly. These are decisions that browsers make that the client can't actually control. But it does add a very minimal overhead to the actual requests, so we don't have to worry about it as much. The mobile clients we ended up looking at and just said, like, cool, you just have to add your header and it'll be fine. So we skipped implementation on that from the trust and safety perspective. Yeah, the alternatives had a similar impact compared to reusing the existing concepts. So while web clients might be easier to implement a lot of the other request types, the mobile clients might have had quite significant issues. And so yeah, we just had to weigh it out and pick the first one effectively. We also use Synapse in Matrix Media repo, which is a project that I maintain myself, just to ensure that federation works between servers, because we are changing the federation format. It now uses a multi-part format, particularly in the MSc, and we found out that Python doesn't support multi-part very well, and that was unexpected, because there was a library on Golang, which is what MMR is based off of, and so the theory was that this would be transferable to other languages and other frameworks as well. Python and Twisted just doesn't support that multi-part though, and so Synapse in particular had to basically invent one and create that, and so that ended up taking a little bit more time. It pushed out the final comment period a little bit on the MSc, but after many reviews and iterations of the MSc itself, it was ready for FCP in July of 2024, and so we started pushing that through and kind of getting it out. Which then brings us into, like, how do we actually get the feature in the hands of users? So we have to consider a rollout plan. MSc 3916 documented this as backwards compatibility. And so we spent quite a bit of time figuring out what this should look like, particularly for such a large feature. And so, yeah, servers should stop serving media on the old endpoints or the unauthenticated endpoints within one spec release was kind of the recommendation. So the spec is released every calendar quarter, roughly every 3 to 5 months if we can. And so, yeah, the idea was that it would be released in Matrix 1.11, and it was. And so by Matrix 1.12, which should be coming out hopefully next week, all servers should be no longer serving that unauthenticated or old media. And so media uploaded from before that freeze happened, so whatever date you choose within that one spec release cycle, should remain accessible. We want to make sure that people who have already posted links out in the wild on social media or whatever can still maintain those links, but we don't want to support that going forward. And so any media that's uploaded after that is considered authenticated only. The old endpoints no longer work. You can no longer reference them in your tweets or your Mastodon posts or anything like that. Servers obviously also need to consider what their local ecosystem looks like. So this might be what clients are affected, which users are affected, which servers you federate with, which might be implementing different freeze dates, and whether or not they send a lot of media to those servers and that server hasn't updated yet, or something similar. And so for Matrix.org, we plan to do it just relatively quickly. We wanted to get it done within a couple months of the actual MSC being approved, because we were having issues with a lot of people using Matrix as a CDN, and so we wanted to stop a lot of that. And so, yeah, we were going to roll it out very quickly. We made sure to note that in the actual MSC, so other people had an idea of what one of the largest servers in Matrix was considering. And then finally, yeah, there are just error codes in the actual MSC, so we could actually track how people were adopting this. We could use matrix.org to see whether or not the date needed to move, and just overall see what was kind of going on in the ecosystem. We called all of this the media freeze. So the freeze date is when media is no longer accessible on the old endpoints. It's only accessible on the authenticated endpoints. And yeah, we documented in the 1.11 release, and about a week later, we put out the dedicated sunset post, which outlined all of this. If you haven't read it yet, I do recommend giving it a read, because it does outline quite a bit of the rationale behind authenticated media as well. So for matrix.org, we had quite a few different considerations here. We have millions of users who could be impacted. Some of them are on old clients. Some of them might not be. We want to try and support as many users as we can. Not all of them are going to be able to actually support this change, though. And so we will have quite a bit of support load. There will be a percentage that just will not be able to access media anymore. And we have to figure out how to minimize that as much as we can. Developers can also start relying on that final design now that it's sort of between final comment period and actual MSC acceptance. We can try to make sure that developers have those features early and that users aren't as impacted. We can help our matrix.org users by making sure that their clients are also updated and sort of actually working. And so we set up beta.matrix.org to actually mimic the freeze well in advance of matrix.org itself. So developers could use that server and users could use that server to see what the impact was on them and make whatever changes they needed, so that way their users weren't as affected. On matrix.org, we were actually monitoring the number of requests that were going to the new versus the old endpoints, just to see what might have, if we needed to move the date or not, just to see how many people were actually using this sort of stuff. And we were seeing pretty good progress. We were seeing about 80% of requests being authenticated by about 3 weeks before the actual freeze date, or the original freeze date. But as we got kind of closer, we noticed that some clients, particularly Element Web, which a lot of our users were using, were having bugs with their service worker, and it just wasn't really applying correctly. And so we pushed it out by a week just to give those clients a little bit more time to release and actually reach their users. But critically, most users on matrix.org just didn't notice. When we did the freeze on September 4th, most people just continued on, which was the full intention there. But there were a few things that probably could have been done better. So we're still in the process of actually rolling out the full authenticated media across the ecosystem. But just as a sort of early retrospective, more implementations might have been good for the MSC. It turns out that Conduit and Dendrite and those sorts of other non-Synapse servers didn't really get support until late in the rollout cycle, and they were also having some similar issues with the actual implementation. So typically an MSC only requires one implementation to actually get through the FCP process. But in this case, because the feature is so large and it impacts literally the whole ecosystem, potentially next time we would consider having more implementations be either a requirement or a soft requirement of the actual MSC process itself. Some clients also just didn't get the blog post that we sent out, and as soon as we froze media on matrix.org later that week, some clients were just like, hey, what happened here? And then they became aware of the change. And so this was a couple months after a spec release, and after a blog post itself, and several messages in other places. And so sometimes it's just hard to reach every developer that's out in the ecosystem. And so next time we might consider trying to figure out where those developers are, or bringing them closer to the rooms at the bottom of the slide there, where client developers and server developers can actually get quite a bit of context from both each other, but also any changes that might actually affect their users well in advance. We might also have considered a longer rollout on matrix.org. We rolled out Authenticated Media within 2 months of the spec release, which was quite fast. We aren't sure if that was a good or a bad thing yet, honestly. We're still looking at the metrics and trying to see if a longer rollout would have been beneficial. But at least for the moment, we think that it was the correct decision with the information we had. So there is that sort of, I guess, a little bit of reassurance, at least for ourselves. Unfortunately, though, we forgot guest access requirements for the new endpoints. So guest accounts are something that's somewhat unique to Matrix and a little bit weird, but a lot of clients, before you log in, do have this guest support. And turns out that they couldn't download media, but they could before because it was unauthenticated. So we had to fix that with a new MSC 4189. That one's currently waiting on, I think, just one checkbox from a spec core team member. So if that's one of you in the room, please check that box, and we'll be able to get it through the FCP process pretty quickly here. We also forgot about widgets. Widgets tend to be forgotten about quite a lot, and for that I am very sorry. But thanks to the team behind MSC 4039, they were able to actually figure out a solution there, unbreak some sticker pickers and some other sort of custom widgets there. We also just didn't detail out the alternatives very well in the MSC. This is a process oversight. Ideally, the MSC would have documented, in particular, why not use cookies, because that one seemed like a very strong alternative. And so as we continue to work through the remaining rollout, we will be investigating a lot of those alternatives in more detail and documenting them on the MSC. But yeah, we have to figure out how to make sure that we don't forget the alternatives there. And so that's kind of with the spec core team to figure out what process mechanisms we might need in place to make sure that the MSC actually does have quite a strong alternative section. But in the meantime, there are just, a few remaining things before the actual rollout is done. So Synapse and MMR are going to continue to enable the media freeze by default soon. Currently, it is a configuration flag on both that is disabled by default, but that default will change, and eventually the configuration flag will disappear entirely. So that is going to happen soon. There is no timeline. But I would expect probably by the end of the year that the configuration flag will be disappearing from both projects. Other servers might have their own timelines, so I would encourage people to check with those developers to see what those timelines might be. We also plan to remove the authenticated endpoints, which are currently deprecated from the Matrix spec, but they're not going to disappear from the implementations because obviously we still have those links to that are in social media posts and all that, so we don't want to break those. So they're going to stick around for probably a number of years, but we have that media freeze in place. So any media that is uploaded from September 4th forward, particularly on matrix.org, will only be accessible on the new endpoints. And so the old media can exist behind the old endpoints in the meantime. The other remaining thing is just deleting media when the associated events are redacted. This might be one or multiple events. We have to figure out a lot of these details. MSC 3911 documents quite a bit of this. There are some open questions. The MSC also needs an update to actually consider what has happened in MSC 3916. But as we continue to work through this problem and figure it out, we'll be updating the MSC as well. That might take a little bit of a longer time just because the Trust and Safety team has been on Authenticated Media since early this year, and so we're just kind of taking a small break working on another project before we take on linked media in particular. We also have to fix private browsers. So Authenticated Media was broken in a private browser, unfortunately, because service workers just don't work in a lot of different private browsing scenarios like Firefox and Chrome. So we have to figure out what the V2 even looks like, possibly the backwards compatibility with what V1 is, and then we have to also figure out what the rollout is. So hopefully we can use a lot of the ideas from our retrospective here and take that to the V2. But overall, that is how we ended up trying to actually get authenticated media out into the hands of users and into the spec and everywhere else. And so, yeah, hopefully it wasn't too painful. But thank you. I can take some questions if there is time.
Thank you, Travis. Please raise your hand if you have a question, and those watching the stream may leave their questions in the Matrix room.
So I'm not personally comfortable with plugins, but a friend of mine is working on a plugin because at the moment there's only one for S3, I believe.
Yeah.
How are plugins impacted by this?
So the Synapse modules, I guess, are not overly impacted. I believe Synapse had to make some changes to the actual interface that the modules use. But overall, the implementation, I believe we already updated the S3 module for Synapse because Matrix.org uses it. But yeah, it might depend on just a few function variables and changes to that. But overall, the modules are sort of intended to basically just be a byte repository. And so you just request bytes for an object ID and return that back to the server as requested.
On the same note, will there ever be other plugins?
Possibly. I mean, that is something that a lot of community members are certainly welcome to help with. It might just depend on which platforms you're kind of after. S3 has a lot of compatibility with both, obviously, AWS S3, but also the third-party implementations. So you have your Cloudflare R2 and those sorts of things as well. But if you're looking for, say, like a Google Cloud plugin, that I don't believe exists at the moment. And they also don't have an S3 interface. So I don't believe the backend team has any plans of implementing more soon, but hopefully that is something where the community is more able to implement these things as needed.
Thank you.
There was a quick question from the room. Someone said, "My Synapse server is very old. Do I need to update it so I can download media from matrix.org?"
Yes, is the short version. So you should be updating your Synapse a little bit more regularly. I have a Synapse somewhere in the wild that is 2 years out of date, and I apologize to those users. But there are security updates that come out quite often. Authenticated Media is arguably one of those, just due to the trust and safety concerns. And so, yeah, update your servers, please. You might also have to update your client as well. With Synapse, if the client makes an unauthenticated media request, it also makes an unauthenticated media request over federation. So your client needs to make the authenticated media request in order for the authenticated media request to go over to, say, matrix.org. So please update literally everything and keep them up to date as best you can.
The required Synapse version is 1.111.
Yeah, it's all ones throughout the whole thing.
Do you have an expected timeline for when the old endpoints will be removed from the spec?
I'm hoping that we will be removing them in 1.13. So 1.12 comes out next week, assuming I don't become very busy answering questions about all of my different talks in the next week here. But yeah, so Matrix 1.12 comes out next week, and then we plan to start figuring out the actual disclosure in early October. And then that will lead to, yeah, the actual MSC, which proposes the formal removal of the endpoints from the spec. But yeah, they will not be removed from Synapse or MMR or likely most server implementations.
And follow up, the restriction for servers to continue serving media on the old endpoint from before the freeze, will that be retained in the spec?
So the spec doesn't actually formalize that. The way that the spec has been written is saying that you must use the new endpoints, and the old endpoints are deprecated and should never be used. There is some advice within the spec of how to roll this out, which is that media freeze that I was talking about. And so, yeah, Synapse and a lot of the server implementations are most likely going to maintain that freeze to make sure that users aren't overly impacted, particularly for the next 4 or 5 years.
I'm a little bit unsure if I should see this production ready or experimental. Can you help me out with this for large-scale installations?
Yeah, so it is production ready. I mean, like Matrix.org has rolled it out, and it is working. We are seeing most users are successfully using it. There are obviously concerns with private browsers, but depending on your deployment environment, that may or may not be a concern. So just making sure that your client has support, making sure that your server has support, you should be all set. It's primarily a concern over federation, or where your server publicly federates or privately federates with another server. That is where media can be a little bit more abused. But in general, if you are running a very private deployment, then you might not be totally impacted, and you can delay your rollout until, let's say, a longer LTS or until a longer period of time.
But there could be problems with federated infrastructures, even if it's private federation.
Sorry, I missed the first part of the question.
So there might be problems if I'm in a federated instance, even if it's privately federated.
Yeah, so if you have a private federation, then if one server updates and the others don't, then you have a little bit of a risk there. And so you need to make sure that all of your servers are updated. If you control all of those servers, it makes it a lot easier. If you don't control all of those servers, then you can potentially run into some issues.
Do you know how much of an issue authenticated media is for the Matrix content scanner?
It is an issue. The content scanner is receiving updates for it, I believe. I believe the backend team has been pushing PRs recently. I haven't looked at them personally. I've just seen them fly by. But yeah, there is some impact to that as well, because it was relying on the old endpoints to actually request the media. We were having a similar issue with our moderation bot, Molnir, where it was making unauthenticated requests up to the server. And so we had to do a library update and make sure that things were good. But in general, the actual change should be hopefully fairly trivial.
Thanks.
All right.
All right. I think that is it for questions. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
We will be having, please give Travis a round of applause.